Hey, Joe. Sitting there? What is it? I can sit so I can sneak out of here when I have to go meet someone. Yeah. No. Yeah, I was on the semester, but I did more.
Hello, and welcome to the Institute of Politics Forum tonight on the book, The Bell Curve. As most of you know, in fact, I'm assuming all of you know, this is a book that has aroused much controversy on campus. And in the great tradition of political debate, we thought that we would extend that controversy into the forum here tonight. And I would like to welcome you for your participation in this evening. I think that it should be a very interesting debate. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce the panelists. To my far right and your left is Derek Ho. He is a senior editor on Perspective, Harvard's liberal monthly. To my direct right is Kristen Clark. She is the president of the Black Students Association on campus. I'm Michelle Drake. I'm the chair of the Harvard Political Union here at the Institute of Politics, and we're co-sponsoring tonight's forum with the Student Advisory Committee at the Institute of Politics. To my left, although that sounds rather strange to me, is Brent McGuire. He is a council member on the staff of Peninsula, which is Harvard's conservative magazine, which comes out irregularly, but is always interesting. And further to my left is Whit Padot, who is the president of Harvard Salient, which is Harvard's conservative monthly. So the format of tonight's program will be each of the panelists will make a 3-minute presentation. Then we will move to questioning within the panel, when each of our panel members will have the opportunity to ask either the entire panel or a specific panelist a question. Then I get to ask a question because I'm the moderator. And then it's up to you guys to keep us going from there. So our first speaker will be Kristen.
Almost 30 years ago, Nobel Prize-winning physicist William Shockley advocated sterilization of people with low IQ and supported the creation of sperm banks for the, quote, geniuses. 30 years later, Richard J. Herrnstein and Charles Murray reassert the same disturbing theories to justify 1, segregation of the cognitive elite, 2, elimination of social welfare programs, and 3, redistribution and reallocation or mere security of all our nation's wealth and benefits in the hands of whites, Asians, and Jews. Well, our country has already gone through several periods of what I term race wars, or periods that are somewhat fueled by racial tensions. We've gone through the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow. We've endured legal battles from Plessy versus Ferguson to Brown versus Board of Ed. And 50 years ago, colleges and all educational institutions were still legally segregated. The years of the civil rights movement were characterized by a brutal struggle to institute the law and protect the right to educate blacks. This stabilization process is still taking place today. Blacks have not yet achieved universal, equalized educational opportunities. The self-fulfilling prophecy rings true today. Children remain vulnerable to messages of teachers, of the media, and of so-called scholars. Children mold themselves accordingly, and psychology justifies the fact that children become what they are told to become, or at least that's all that they strive to become. The Harlem Youth Opportunities Unlimited is one of many authorities which assert the fact that teachers' expectations have a direct correlation on pupils' academic performance. Poor images and poor messages make children discouraged and unmotivated. In other words, messages such as that extended by the bell curve theory only serve to perpetuate the cycle of underachievement. Are Murray and Herrnstein truly qualified to draw relationships between intelligence and IQ? Well, Herrnstein spent a great portion of his time studying pigeons. He studied their ability to direct nuclear warhead missiles. Most importantly, he examined the effects of reward and punishment on the behavior of pigeons. Charles Murray stated that, quote, severe social stigma and poverty is a rightful punishment for poor single mothers. The bell curve theory lays out a groundwork based on reward and punishment. Jews who are at the top of this hierarchy get the rewards, and blacks who are at the bottom of this hierarchy get the punishment. In fact, they conclude by stating that, quote, "It is time for America once again to try living with inequality. I assert that to live with inequality and to accept it is against the fundamental principle of democracy. Those who work to manipulate ideas and abstractions are the leaders and beneficiaries of our society." That's a quote taken from the inside flap of the Bell Curve Theory book. Indeed, Murray and Herrnstein have manipulated and thwarted information for their own particular benefit. They have excluded data, and they have used selective samples to derive their own weak conclusions. The bell curve theory has no application or weight in our American society.
Thank you. Our next speaker is going to be Whit.
Thank you. I'm going to try to limit my comments tonight to the bell curve as opposed to the historical plight of blacks in America. I do agree with the premises and some of the conclusions of the bell curve. I do not, however, agree with much of the logic and many of the implications of Murray's conclusions about how America should deal with what is indeed a very real social problem. Fundamentally, as I've been quoted as saying, I find Murray and Herrnstein's claims about differences in IQ measurements as they present them in the book to be at least apparently statistically sound. I'd say there's no systematic exclusion of data in that sense. However, I remain fundamentally troubled by the assertion that these IQ scores can be reduced to be alleged proxies for inherent cognitive ability, which is a key phrase that's used in the book, is cognitive ability. The implication is that there's something genetically, biologically inferior or superior in terms of intelligence, and I'm just not ready to make that belief based on the views which are presented in the book. The authors claim that they're controlling for every last variable imaginable, be it parents' birth weight, right on down. I can't imagine that they'd be willing to claim that these tests would have measured equal intelligence from a random population sample 200 years ago as they would from a random population sample today. And as a result, I think that certainly these tests will show different scores across different cultural groups, different socioeconomic groups, but I don't think we can make a determination about cognitive ability from that. I do, however, believe that at the post-secondary education level and in something approaching a welfare state, it's inappropriate to try to throw more money at the problem. And as these two suggest, less money at certain later stages is probably appropriate because acting earlier on to correct these educational lack of opportunity is a way to fix the problem in the long run and not simply to starve money from groups which have not had these opportunities outright. But as far as closer to home debate goes, I'm curious as to how Murray and Herrnstein can be attacked for their efforts to promote discourse on the matter, and then for the most vocal critics to immediately turn around and make claims about the alleged superiority of blacks in terms of mental, physical, and spiritual abilities. And I don't see how that is any more defensible than what is certainly a genuine effort at a statistically backed claim. So hopefully tonight we'll be able to find out just what it is which is motivating the attacks on Murray and Herrnstein, whether it's indeed a statistical claim or whether it's simply just another effort to highlight the cause without really advancing it.
Thanks. Derek?
Good evening. Kristen doesn't believe that the science in the bell curve is correct, and Whit apparently has bought all the arguments, the scientific arguments in the bell curve. Tonight, I would like to outline what I think are the many scientific flaws in the bell curve which undermine the scientific argument that Murray and Herrnstein make, because I believe that that is at the root of this debate. And what Murray and Herrnstein argue is basically four-pronged. First, they rely on the fact that there is such a thing as G, general intelligence, which is basically the compilation of many subtests that measure specific intellectual capacities. And the first point that I'd like to make is you'll notice that there is no difference between IQ among the two genders. There has been no discourse about whether men might have higher IQs than women or vice versa. And the reason for that is that G has been defined such that men's IQs and women's IQs are equal. Now, that gives you some indication of how deductive this thing called G actually is. If we can define away the potential differences in IQ between the genders, why couldn't we, as plausibly, define into G racial differences in IQ? The second point that I'd like to make is that Murray and Herrnstein also rely on the fact that IQ is heritable between 40% and 80%. And in the footnote, which of course no one reads, except for me maybe, they argue that it is heritable from 40 to 80% based on two studies done by one Thomas Bouchard, which was based on a study with 65 monozygotic twins. And basically, they conclude that since this study said that the heritability was 0.72, then, and the lower range was 0.38, that therefore the heritability was approximately 40% to 80%. That, I think, demonstrates to you how accurate the science is in the bell curve. Third, Murray and Herrnstein depend on the argument that genetic differences are heritable. And there are many, many counterexamples. I don't have time to go through them now. But Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland differ by 15 points in IQ, and the last time I checked, both those groups are white. Another counterexample is that a pediatrician did a number of studies with nutrition and IQ and found that babies that are breastfed can have IQs higher by 8.3 points. That demonstrates that IQ is not heritable at 40 to 80%, or else Murray and Herrnstein are just wrong. Basically, I believe that the science behind the bell curve is flawed. I believe that there are many, many counterexamples and counterarguments, and I'd be happy to share them with you if and when I have more time to.
Thanks. Our final speaker is going to be Brent.
Before I begin, I'd just like to say how refreshing it is to be here at the one corner of the country, it seems, that still takes liberal ideas seriously. I really sympathize with the IOP administrators, who, this place being the refuge for political has-beens that it is, must have a lot of applications to sift through now that the elections are over. But we're here to discuss the bell curve. The book's treatment of IQ inequalities between races, according to President Clinton, goes against our entire history and our whole tradition. Now, I assume the president is referring to the modern liberal tradition, because he sure isn't going to find such a heritage, at least as he understands it, in the history of the United States. Surely he's not thinking of the Declaration of Independence, which, yes, does refer to equality, but clearly in terms of individuals' unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He won't find it in its author, Jefferson, who believed in a natural aristocracy. He won't even find it in Lincoln. The great emancipator was a white separatist, after all. He won't even find it in that most progressive of high court decisions, the famous 1955 Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, the name so hallowed in the liberal mindset that disagreement with its argumentation, not its conclusion, mind you, just its argumentation, cost Robert Bork a seat in the Supreme Court. In it, we read that lower courts are to ensure that students are admitted to public schools on a, quote, racially non-discriminatory basis. Only 10 years later did compulsory busing begin, a system that explicitly discriminated on the basis of race, assigning black children to this school, white children to that. Liberals, in their support of busing programs to achieve racial equality, have been violating the express language of the heralded Brown decision for the last 25 years. It is here that Clinton's so-called tradition of equality begins. But it is a view of equality severely unlike that of our founders, who knew different men unequal in their capacities, some stronger, some swifter, some, yes, even smarter. Their idea of equality was grounded on the fact that we are all created in the image and likeness of God. Theirs was a spiritual equality. But modern liberals, of course, don't worship the God of the founders, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that is. They worship the God of egalitarianism. And liberals today are wailing, gnashing their teeth, staging demonstrations on the steps of Widener, all because Murray and Herrnstein dare to say that their God is dead. The Procrustean ideal of equality shared by Clinton and perhaps the rest of this panel is pernicious and rotten to the core. It says that, doggone it, I don't care how unqualified they are, I want to see 13% of the professional workforce comprised of blacks. It says that I don't care how tough a situation we're putting them in, this school better hire a proportionate number of minorities. Well, the believers in earthly utopia notwithstanding, Americans don't strive for material equality. No one out there tonight thinks to himself, gee, if only I could be equal to my neighbor. No, you want to be better, at least in some way, than your neighbor. And some of us, as we all knew growing up, have a better chance of pulling this off than others. We always knew who the gifted ones were. The liberals are terrified tonight because their material view of human worth has been severely challenged. It has always been the liberals and not the conservatives who said that it's all a matter of dollars and cents. The liberal says give the guy a welfare check and he's happy. The conservative says no, living off the labor of another assaults one's dignity. The man must earn a living. Marx said economics is everything. Socrates, our guy, said man had a soul. If Murray and Herrnstein put too much emphasis on intelligence, they do so only because liberals put too much emphasis on material wealth, which to them is all there is. The liberals, in attempting to denigrate this book, really have no moral leg to stand on. I myself have a problem with page 549, which advocates government policies to ensure, quote, birth control mechanisms that are increasingly flexible, foolproof, inexpensive, and safe for dull women. But the liberals' patron saint, George van Elders, advocates the same thing. Are liberals worried that if this business about the heritability of IQ is true, that technology will eventually allow parents to abort children on the basis of intelligence? This is a strange thing, considering liberals defend abortion for every other reason, the child's sex, economic potential, eye color, you name it. What's wrong with one more criterion? In this debate over intelligence, it's not those who say there is a genetic component to IQ that scare me. Not only is the fact intuitively obvious, but literally hundreds of studies, not just the two Derek mentioned, comparing the IQ correlations of identical twins raised in separate environments with those of fraternal twins raised in separate environments, bear this fact out empirically. No, those who truly scare me are the ones who say that IQ is completely environmental, that IQ is something to be manipulated by the state. Stalin believed such a thing, and he slaughtered millions to prove himself right.
Thanks. Thanks, Brent. And I wanted to thank you for your sympathy. The IOP appreciates that. Now we're going to move into a time when our panelists have the opportunity to question one another, and we're going to do this question and answer period in the reverse order that the panelists spoke. So Brent has the opportunity to direct the first question.
Well, I'm going to address my first question to Derek. I'm sure Derek's familiar with the section in the book that points out that when you account for IQ, all the wage differentials between blacks, all the disparities between whites in high occupations and high IQ occupations or high-profile occupations like lawyers, dentists, and so forth, and blacks vanishes. Not only does it vanish, but in most cases do you see an edge given to blacks, demonstrating that affirmative action not only has worked, but has worked more than it should have. There's no longer equality. There's actually an edge given to blacks of equal ability as whites. My question to you is, in your Crimson article, you said that you would like the government to take more radical steps to promote equality. What radical steps do you advocate, and why on earth do you think they'll work?
Thank you, Brent, for that inspiring question. And I thank your fan club as well for their wonderful applause.
Recent converts.
First of all, I disagree entirely with the science put forth in Murray and Herrnstein's article. And I'll respond to the section of the book that you're referring to, which is basically that Murray and Herrnstein try to isolate the factor of IQ by holding all other factors equal. And that's the way in which they try to determine how much of an effect IQ actually has on these different factors: poverty, welfare dependency, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem in doing that the problem in so-called regression equations is that when you hold all the other factors constant, you are actually affecting genetic components, not only environmental components. Genes and environment are inherently interrelated, and the fact that you might hold someone's socioeconomic status constant actually means that you are obscuring some genetic components which you would otherwise have seen had you not held that variable constant. And that's what's known in statistics as the collinearity in regression equations. Therefore, I dispute the fact that the differences are entirely genetic. But on the second point, and this sort of reinforces my first point, there have been studies which show social programs which do, in fact, raise the IQ of children. A study done at the University of Bourgogne in France, which happens to have the best social welfare system in the world, especially for infants, showed that if you put infants in daycare at 2 years old, you can raise the IQ of low-income children to the level of high-income children who do not enter school until 5. Therefore, there are methods by which you can improve the IQ of children through social programs, and that's where I disagree with you.
Thank you. It's your turn to ask a question now, so go for it.
Okay. I'll direct this one back at Brent, I guess. In my speech, I gave several counterexamples which call into question the veracity of the bell curves. Science, and these were based on, I think everyone would agree, reliable sources. By contrast, the bell curve draws on a number of sources which people have found to be questionable. First of all, it relies largely on the studies of 3 people: Arthur Jensen, who's cited 23 times in the book, Richard Lynn, who's cited 24 times, and Roger Pearson. All these 3 people are associated with a publication named Mankind Quarterly, which argues that blacks are worthless, and that's a quote from the founder of this publication, which also argues that the purpose of the publication is to counter egalitarian influences and to assert the, quote, genetic superiority of whites. Based on this, based on the source of these statistics and studies, why should we believe the science in the bell curve?
Yeah, I love this type of argument. What you do is you point to these 3 researchers. You find a journal that they published some of their works in, and you find a statement uttered by its editor in 1967, and I guess your legal advisors have told you that this is racist, so therefore we can dismiss the researchers themselves. I don't buy that. I'd rather hear arguments against the studies themselves, which I still think you failed to prove. Murray and Herrnstein don't discount environmental factors in the improvement of cognitive ability. In fact, there's a whole chapter on raising cognitive ability, which does show that you can raise it through environmental forces, but there are no known diminishing returns to intelligence, so that yes, you can improve the intelligence of both whites and blacks, but as you move up in improvement, socioeconomic conditions, for instance, influence IQ and improve it, the gap actually widens. So it's all fine and good to say that yes, we can improve a person's IQ through say nutrition and other environmental forces, but unless you're going to argue that we should keep whites down so that blacks can keep an equal, so that we can raise blacks to the same level, I don't think you've really touched upon the central argument of the bell curve.
Whit?
Thanks. I have a question for Kristen. I was actually read your the letter to the Crimson regarding the alleged superior mental, physical, and spiritual abilities of blacks. And I was wondering how that was any more defensible a statement than the Murray and Herrnstein effort. That was the Murray Herrnstein effort is claimed to be an outrageous effort at academic discourse and unproductive. I was wondering how the alternative claim was any more productive.
Well, I will reiterate for the third time in public that those views were not offered as my own personal opinions. In my capacity as president of the Black Students Association, my job is to place information on the table. Now, throughout the bell curve theory, there were a lot of arguments which Murray and Herrnstein failed to refute, the melanin theory being one of them. And it is a key issue when you have one thing saying A and the other thing saying Z. Now, since I'm on this topic, I invite all of you guys to go down to the Crimson and look back in the May 13th, 1993 issue of the Crimson, where the Crimson editorial staff defended Harvey Mansfield's right of freedom of speech. Mansfield was not forced into stating whether he believed blacks were inferior, but he did say that blacks were responsible for grade inflation and so forth and so forth. And the Crimson staff said that, give me 1 minute please, that no student, faculty, or administrator should feel threatened or intimidated by making unclear statements which might come across as threatening or defensive to some. So the Crimson is very hypocritical, if you ask me, to attack me and to assume that that information I offered was offered as my own opinion. Thank you.
Okey-doke, it's your turn now, Kristen.
My question is for Whit, actually. I think the fundamental question behind the bell curve theory is whether you can define race as in a genetic sense, or is it merely a social construction? Murray and Herrnstein define race as groups of people who differ in characteristic ways. That's fairly vague if you ask me. The American Heritage Dictionary defines race as a group of people distinguished by genetically transmitted physical characteristics. I argue that intelligence is not a physical characteristic. And in the 1970s, a study was done that showed that 34% of people participating in a census survey changed their racial identification from one year to the next. Can you please lay on the table a definition of race in light of your introductory comments?
Sure. In the book, as I understand it, Murray and Herrnstein define race on a self-reported basis, which is to say that for their statistical studies, it's going to be based on what the participants believe. Now, obviously, for any citations which they're incorporating, it depends on the studies that they're bringing in. But for their purposes, I believe that they're doing it based on a self-classification. I do agree and want to reiterate, though, that fundamentally, I don't believe that there is a difference in cognitive ability, or at least I'm not convinced that there's a difference in cognitive ability between races, however defined, or among any discernible segment of the population. I am convinced that currently there's a difference on some of these intelligence tests. Do I think that intelligence is inherent cognitive ability? No. But I am willing to cede to Herrnstein and Murray's definition of race, which is whatever the people consider themselves.
Okay, now it's my turn. I'm going to actually make a statement first, and it might seem like a little bit of an oversimplification, but I'm a gov major, so that's what I know how to do. It seems to me that one of the fundamental questions underlying the bell curve, and I believe actually underlying people's reactions to it, is a differing idea of what equality means and what society ought to be like. And when people first hear about the bell curve theory, they have a reaction to it, and I don't believe that that reaction is necessarily scientific, that it's one which involves examination of statistical data. I think that we tend to reject or accept the bell curve theory based on our preconceived notions of how society ought to be. And it seems to me that it would be particularly useful for the purposes of the rest of tonight's discussion if each of our panelists could give some sort of insight into how they conceive society as it ought to operate. Because as soon as we begin to talk about issues of equality and issues of government relations with citizens, we start to talk about ideals for society. And it seems to me that on a fundamental level, that's where conflict tends to arise between the panelists. And I know that that's a rather large question to ask you to answer briefly, but if you could somehow give us some sort of insight into what you believe society ought to be like and how people ought to relate to one another, I think that that would give us some sort of insight into where your opinions are coming from. So actually, I think we'll just go from left to right. Or right to left, as the case may be.
As far as my opinion on an ideal society, theories of equality, I firmly believe in equality of opportunity, but I believe in that equality being instilled early on and not being corrected for or compensated for after the fact or halfway through the game, or any re-equalization which our government might try to instill on us. I firmly believe that our primary education should be significantly better as offered at the public level, and that by trying with, again, publicly funded and available to all quality education much earlier on, we'll be able to achieve, or we'll have less necessity for these efforts to equalize down the road when it really may be too late. Marie and Hertzstein do have a discussion of the merits of affirmative action, although it's not the portion of the book which is generally contested, because that is beyond the issue of whether or not there is a difference in inherent cognitive ability, which would suggest that the government stop trying to equalize the opportunities for the races, or to believe that if equality of performance couldn't be achieved, that somehow suggested that there were disparate fundamental abilities. I don't believe that there is a correlation between an ideal society, though, and equality of outcome. I think that the point about the natural segregation of a cognitive elite, well, semantically, certainly reducible to a number of different interpretations, that I go for. If indeed an intellectual elite arises out of every society, so long as there's been equality of opportunity from early on throughout the educational process, I'm comfortable with that.
Okay, thank you. Brent?
I believe in judging people as individuals.
Thank you. Moving on, Kristen.
Well, I think that if we were ever to create an environment where we all can get along, which is a generic term, we have to work at creating some kind of communal identity where my problems are your problems, Brent, and your problems are mine. And we both work to see each other build. And that does involve considering the past history of this country and a lot of the false structuring which has resulted now. There's a need for affirmative action and welfare to correct a lot of the past wrongs which have been done. And what I fear and what I'm hearing come out on some of the panelists' comments is that the burden should be on certain individuals, but the reality in this country is that we aren't looked at as individuals, and I think we need to be a little bit more realistic and realize that we have all been lumped into groups and races which are social constructions, and equality to me is finding or creating some kind of balance where all groups can subsist and have opportunity to achieve in this country.
Thanks. Derek?
I agree in part with some of the things both Whit and Kristen said, and I find what Brent said to be fairly unfeasible. Just as Murray and Herrnstein find that it's sort of a genetic fact in quotes, that IQ is heritable. I believe that it's a psychological fact that will be very difficult, if not impossible, to overcome, that people identify themselves with groups. Groups based on whatever characteristic you want, ethnicity, religion, there are millions of variables on which that can be based. Equally a fact, I believe, is that other people judge others based on their characteristics within a group. And therefore, I don't believe, Brent, that you're discussing reality when you say that people should just be seen as atomized individuals. And what I believe, the reason why I believe Murray and Herrnstein do a disservice to the goal which they explicitly state at the outset, which is that, and I quote, "this nation needs a narrowing of differences," is that they attempt to cause one group to look down on another. And I don't say that just because of the scientific evidence that they put forth, but I say that because of the conclusions that they draw from that scientific evidence. They state that the implication of the bell curve is that minorities, namely blacks, should engage in, quote, "wise ethnocentrism," which is basically, if you're not smart, well, don't think of being smart as important. Think of other things as being important. If you can sing but you can't read, well, then singing should be the thing that you should be most worried about. I mean, it's that type of argument which I believe is an attempt to pacify minorities, and in particular blacks. And I believe that it is the acceptance of the fact that groups must be seen as equal in order for justice to exist in society, which Murray and Herrnstein refuse to address.
Thank you. We're now going to have time for audience questions. There are 2 microphones set up, one on the left, or my left, your right, and one over here. And if before you ask your question, if you could state your name and your Harvard affiliation, if you have one, and any other relevant information that I don't know we might want to know.
Hi, my name is Christopher Garcia. I'm a senior at the college, and this comment in question is directed at Brent. I was intrigued by your comments, Brent, because you, as opposed to the other people on the panel, offered a philosophy, and you veered very far astray from the substance of the scientific matters in the book, at least in your introductory remarks. And you offered a philosophy. In the course of this philosophy that you offered, you mentioned the equality of souls, and that people should be treated as equals because we're all people with souls. And it's a very noble philosophy to respect the dignity of everybody's soul. Given that, I would like to ask you, because I know you're a thoroughgoing Christian, as I am, at what point in the invective of your arguments do you say, I will treat people with the dignity they deserve as equals, and where does the debate find closure for you? Given your scientific beliefs, where do you get beyond them? Unless you're, of course, willing to argue that traditionally blacks and Hispanics and other minority groups have been treated equally and with equal dignity. I don't think they have. So controlling for the fact that they haven't been treated with equal dignity, and this is a value you hold, at what point do you leave the debate from where you're sitting and offer some remedy, some positive affirmation of the dignity of other people's souls?
Well, first of all, I'd say that neither have Asians and Jews, yet they come out on top in these sorts of studies. I think we err when we try to equate, as you point out, the discussion of souls, intelligence with wisdom. Cognitive ability in the bell curve is simply the ability to do well on IQ tests, which happens to be an excellent predictor of future performance, a better predictor than anything else we know. Now, whatever it is, call it eggs. I don't care. Call it G, call it intelligence, call it whatever. I mean, the fact is, whatever it is has something to do with how we perform economically, at least, in society. Now, what I was trying to get at in my opening remarks was the fact that perhaps we praise, all of us, whites and blacks, economic success too much. And so that's what I answer.
Okay, I just want to let you guys know again, there's a microphone over here, and you'll get to ask your questions sooner if you're over there. I don't know, maybe you guys think it's the dirty microphone. I guess we'll go back over here for the question.
Hi, my name is David Porter, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Organizational Behavior Program. And it's a joint program between the business school and the psychology and sociology departments. And this discussion is really interesting because, you know, what Herrnstein and Murray are really talking about is really at the intersection of both psychology and sociology. It's really this fundamental debate, this fundamental question about, well, is it psychological, is it biological, what determines how well people are going to do, or is it, as sociologists say, you know, where it really depends on structural things, I mean. And I guess I have a question for the people who are on the right of the political spectrum, I guess on your left, my right. And I guess one of the things that, I guess what this guy in the name's in is Derek, I think. He made a good point about the problem with collinearity, the problem that theoretically, it's empirically impossible to separate the black community or the disadvantaged communities within our country and say that, okay, well, they aren't performing as well, and they also happen to be this racial group, and so because these two groups are linked, it's impossible really to statistically separate them. So it's impossible to draw the conclusion that Herrnstein and Murray are trying to get to. But one of the things that really concerns me and what people seem to be ignoring is that—
Is your question coming
Yes,
up?
there's a
Okay.
question that's coming. But
All right.
I mean, the problem is the argument's very complex, and I think that one of the things that this discussion is doing is cutting it really short shrift. But I guess the question the fundamental question I'm asking is, one, how do you separate that and separate the reality of, you know, there's this collinearity, there's this covariance between people of color and, quote, low IQ scores, and then if you agree that there's this problem of the two are linked, how can you ever determine whether it's a biological determinant and not a structural social determinant that, you know, society is in some ways racist, as it is in some ways sexist, and those disadvantage certain people? And so I don't know if that was too complex, but I wanted to give you enough background so that you'd be able to at least think about the question thoughtfully.
Well,
You guys can pick who goes first. Go for it, Brent.
I mean, there are statistical means of dealing with collinearity, and I think Murray and Herrnstein do follow those methods. The fact is that, well, if you're worried that that somehow socioeconomic status is somehow doubling, or intelligence is merely reinforcing the socioeconomic effect, well, then ask yourself, does socioeconomic background predict intelligence, or is it vice versa? And it's clear that it's vice versa. Intelligence predicts socioeconomic status, and working from that basis, you can then make the sort of regression equations that Derek finds so startling. I think that it's also interesting to point out that when you, I think I've said this before, that when you, since IQ is such a predictor of performance, and it is, you can isolate groups. What they've taken is, say, the Armed Service Selective Battery Test. So you've got a very isolated group, which is immune from sort of the socioeconomic, the sort of structural problems you find in the economy at large, and you find that IQ is a great predictor of performance. That if you know a group's IQ, average IQ, you can predict fairly well its average performance. Now, knowing this, you would expect blacks and whites, if there were racism in society at such great proportions that we think, the IQ to underpredict black performance in society. Yet we find it overpredicts, that blacks are actually doing much better than we'd expect from their IQ scores. And this is the effect of affirmative action, that we've actually gone past equality, and we're now seeing when you take a black of an IQ of 114 and a white of an IQ of 114, the black is making twice as much as the white.
I can't follow
Twice,
up. I
yeah,
wish I
twice.
could.
It's, yeah.
Because there's actually some
It's
flaws
between
in the
1.5 and 2.
I'll take a crack at the statistical issue. Collinearity, I do believe, is pretty darn tough, if not impossible, to deal with, but it's not perfect collinearity. It's high correlation. And there are statistical methods to deal with that, and deep in the appendix of this book, Murray and Herrnstein lay out some of their statistical methods. And after the second or third embedded sigma, I confess I gave up. But there are certainly multiple stage, least squares, regression techniques even where you can try to separate highly correlated descriptive variables. So it is not empirically impossible to make valid conclusions about explanatory variables even when they are highly correlated.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move over to this microphone.
Okay, my name's Charles Goodman. I'm a sophomore at the college. I have two questions, both brief, both directed to Mr. McGuire. First of all, given that you say that individuals should be judged on an individual basis, and given that we know that early childhood environment correlates very strongly with IQ, do you believe that individuals who have experienced very, very disadvantageous backgrounds, whether because of historical discrimination or not, are entitled to some kind of assistance from society? And second, on a point which is rather irrelevant, but you brought it up, what is your opinion? What is your opinion about the arguments of many historians that your man, Socrates, was bisexual?
I think this is
Well-
all you, Brent.
Okay, let's start with the first question. Let's take a long time with the first question. Yes, I do think society has an obligation. We are our brother's keeper. Derek faulted me for saying we should judge people as individuals. If I remember right, the question was not one of what's the real world, it's one of an ideal. And yeah, it would be better if we judge people as individuals, ideally. But no, you're right, we can't separate the individual from the group he identifies himself with. But I do think that I believe in what at least Roman Catholic political economy calls subsidiarity, that if there's a problem, it's best dealt with as close to the problem as possible. I don't think the federal government should be involved in the sorts of programs that Derek thinks it should be involved in. The local community should, because the local community knows what the problems are. As far as Socrates, yeah, I'd sleep with him.
I think we are all getting a lot more than we bargained for, but we'll just move on. If you have any more personal questions for Brent, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer them after the panel. We're going to take a question from over there.
It's your night, Brent. I agree with you on one thing, which is that this debate, and disagree with Whit, must be contextualized with the history of this nation. I take issue with your skewed view of the history of political thought in this nation. I want to ask you a couple of questions. One, I want to ask you how you reconcile all of the thoughts and of the thinkers that you talked about in the beginning with Tocqueville and Madison. And my second question is how you reconcile your misperceptions about affirmative action with the original Bakke case and the fact that affirmative action is really helping in large numbers white women just as much as black people as well. So I want to open that up to you.
Well, I'm not necessarily, I of course don't agree with Lincoln in his view of blacks and whites and the need to, he actually advocated deportation. As far as Madison goes, I would, on this question, I would side, yeah, of course, closer with Madison. But, I mean, even Madison, of course, exchanged letters with Jefferson on the subject of a natural aristocracy. The view that if left alone, there were going to be certain individuals who were going to rise to the top. And, of course, I mean, it wasn't necessarily linked with race, but as far as affirmative action in the Bakke case, again, I think we're all missing a large point here, and that is we first got to deal with the fact, do these IQ differences exist? And if IQ is what it says it is, and it's hard to dispute that it is, how in any way does affirmative action correct these problems? It's sort of the condescending white liberal's way out. He says, the blacks have been discriminated against. Here's my little token effort at solving the problem. And what it's done is actually, worsened the problem by putting blacks in positions that they're not as qualified to be in if affirmative action weren't in place. No, the problem should be addressed much more fundamentally. Steps should be taken to if nutrition is, if nutritional levels is such an important factor in IQ, then we should focus our efforts on those sorts of things. And again, I would not have a federal program to do it, but on the local level. Nutritional programs should be pursued. Anything that has to do with improving the IQs at an early age should be pursued. Affirmative action is too late. By then, it's too late to correct the excess.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, hi. I have a question for Derek about the role of the government in the... Sorry?
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm Steve Wardell. I'm a senior at the college. I have a question for Derek about the role of the government in the aftermath of the bell curve. I think you'd agree with me there's a certain amount of socioeconomic inequality in America today, and government programs are one way to bring about a more equal society. My question is this. Let's say the government equalizes all people's socioeconomic conditions on one day soon. Within 30 years, the country will probably be back to similar levels of inequality. Don't you think that what the country really needs is for the government to be constantly making people equal?
Could I just ask him to clarify?
Sure.
Why necessarily would it revert in 30 years?
Well, because some people would put a great stress on making money, for example, and other people would not. And some people would dedicate themselves to certain professions which are more lucrative, and other people would not.
Okay. Well, I'm not arguing that there should be equality of result, which is, I think, what you're more implying. I'm not arguing that people ought to earn the same amount of money and that government ought to make everybody's status, socioeconomic status, equal on the long term. What I am arguing is that much of socioeconomics, much of what influences equality of opportunity is not that your parents have exactly the same amount of money as the next person's parents, or that you live in exactly the same house, or that your house has exactly the same value. The point that I was trying to make before with the nutrition example is that equality of opportunity, at least in the sense of intelligence in which we're talking, has to do with things that are much more basic. And here I have to respond to Brent, who says that if we improve nutrition, then we have to improve it for all people, and therefore it doesn't solve the problem. But the point is that black infants are breastfed something like 18% of the time, whereas white infants are breastfed 64% of the time, and that's the discrepancy that I'm talking about. So I guess my net answer is that you don't have to equalize people's socioeconomic status strictly in terms of the money that they make. What we're talking about is equalizing their opportunity based on nutrition, based on other not strictly economic but more sociological factors based on which people can pursue opportunity equally.
Should we have a breastfeeding police then to make sure blacks are breastfeeding at higher rates?
No, what we should do...
Blacks should improve their breastfeeding, right? I mean, why is it the government's problem?
Why is it the government's problem? Well, if you take the attitude that you take, which is that the government really ought not give a damn about inequality in society, then I suppose it's not a problem. But what I believe, and what I believe government should believe, is that government does have a role in creating equality of opportunity. And I am not advocating a breastfeeding police. What I'm what I am advocating is perhaps a federally funded but locally implemented program to raise awareness among low income, in particular, black mothers, what is best for their babies, because at this point I don't think perhaps they don't know, perhaps they don't implement it properly. They're basically you know what I mean. I think I'll stop while I'm behind.
We're going to go back over there.
Okay. I had a question for Derek, and that was, you said that you felt like people needed to be viewed as equals to have justice in society. So you made an argument, you said that you don't agree with the science of the bell curve, but does that mean that you should a priori dismiss scientific arguments about inequality between races because equality is necessary for justice? Or, so regardless of whether or not would you be willing to look at scientific arguments that you found more sound, or do you think that they should just be that area of intellectual endeavor should be stricken from the society's list of things to do?
Well, quite frankly, some of everything that you said. I think to some extent there has been in the bell curve what Ernst Gombrich would call idola quantitas, which is essentially an obsession with numbers, an obsession that says what is empirically true, what we can embrace by statistics, by studies, et cetera, is necessarily what ought to have place in our society. And the first point that I'd like to make is that I disagree with that philosophy to some extent, and I think that the basis of race relations ought to be philosophical, not necessarily scientific. And two, I think the question is sort of, well, in some ways irrelevant, because I don't believe that there are genetic differences between races in IQ, and therefore I don't really see the need to address the problem of what we would do if there were. I mean, I simply don't think that Murray and Herrnstein have taken any real steps to prove that there are genetic differences. They've omitted studies. Scar and Weinberg, who are cited profusely in the bell curve, also did a study which said that IQ is actually heritable from somewhere between 10 and 90%, which basically means we don't know. and yet the bell curve fails to cite that study while it cites every other study that pair has ever done. I simply dispute the facts of the book, and I don't believe we need to argue race relations on the grounds that there are genetic differences. I think we need to argue it on the philosophical grounds, assuming that there are not.
Yes?
Yes, my name is Mariah Starr. I'm a first-year student at the college, and my question is for Mr. Prideaux. The bell curve argues, number one, that IQ determines the outcome, and it's also generally known that the environment determines IQ. So, given this, don't you think the government should take some measures to remedy the discrepancies in the environment between blacks and whites for the past few centuries?
Sure. Again, in terms of the past few centuries, in the compensatory or punitive or other sense, contextualizing it, I don't think that is terribly significant in terms of what the government should do. There is indeed a significant disparity in environment, but more explicitly, there's a significant difference in quality of education. As I said before, early on, I ardently believe that the federal government, where the money is able to be spread out more equitably, should take up efforts to provide just a top-notch educational opportunity for everyone. I believe that your education can have a great impact on your IQ, and well, at least under certain measurements, and your education can have an extraordinary impact on the outcome. And yes, at early levels, I think the government should play a significant role in giving everyone a premier education. Later on, no, I don't think that there should be patchwork solutions to try to cause groups which have fallen behind for whatever reasons to be suddenly forced up to speed, so to speak. But yes, early on, I entirely agree.
Hi, my name is Avery Gardner. I'm a sophomore at the college, and I'd like to direct my question to both Kristen and to Brent. I'm concerned that many people who have an opinion on the book actually haven't read it, and I include myself in that number. And I'm wondering what you think the reaction should be of the American people, given that they are hearing perhaps very polar arguments and very polar attitudes about the book in terms of whether it's true or false, whether it's right or wrong, whether it's justified or unjustified. I'm wondering how you believe that if it is true, impacts your different ideological positions and the people around you and your communities?
Well, I guess your question is, have I read the book?
No.
Okay.
But do you think that other people's not having read the book
Well,
is
one,
a problem?
I don't think people
given
need
the
to
big
read this
discussion?
book. I have read the book, but I don't think people need to read this book because Murray and Herrnstein aren't saying anything new. This theory has come up time and time again over the past few centuries, and it's been discredited time and time again. And I think there's a reason why Murray and Herrnstein have put out this 800-page novel at a time which seems to be strategically placed when the election process was going on, a time when students were taking the SAT and applying to schools. And I think Murray and Herrnstein have a deeper strategy which you can really read into if you look at the time when they put out this book. And I don't encourage anyone to go out and read this book. If you want to go out and read the book, go and look at William Shockley and Arthur Jensen and a lot of people that have been shot down way back in the past. Thank you.
Brent?
Well, the book hasn't been discredited. Shockley and Jensen haven't been shot down. They retreated back into academia where their scholarly studies are still reviewed very rigorously by peers. They retreated because the hypersensitivity of the public wouldn't allow them to air their views. I think it's an interesting argument that these sorts of things, the bell curve and Jensen's studies and so forth, affect black performance in the SAT and so forth. Victor Gakis, a professor at the University of Washington, reviewed all the literature that's been done up until that point, this is 1982, on self-esteem of minorities versus whites. And he reviewed the literature and found no difference in self-esteem levels. In fact, if there were any difference, it favored blacks. Blacks had higher self-esteem than whites. They recently, in 1991, Newsweek published an article that showed that a study done on inner-city youth in Chicago schools that found that 14% of black youths actually believe this is kind of depressing, that whites are superior in intelligence, yet 9% of the whites believed it. Now, it's kind of strange that whites are able to impose on blacks this idea that they themselves don't believe to the levels that blacks do. I would say to those who haven't read the book, read it. It's long. It's in many places boring, but it's quite readable. The book is written on a level that the average layman can understand.
Can I add one word to that?
Sure.
But I would warn whoever reads the book that the book is very, very deceptive. And I'll give one example and let the next question come. The book talks about IQ differences in intelligence. And when it talks about intelligence, it means, as I said, G. But as Murray and Herrnstein go along, they substitute adjectives for intelligent or not intelligent, such as dumb, smart, bright, and dull, as if somebody with very low G is inherently dull.
Thank you for that little caveat. We're going to move over here.
My name is Alice Ristroff. I'm a junior at the college, and I have two sort of related questions for Brent. Going back to what Derek asked you earlier about this journal, Mankind Quarterly, your response to it seemed to indicate that you had read the same article in the New York Review of Books that discusses this. And if you have, then you probably know that in this article, Charles Lane examined the sources, behind the statistical, the research behind the bell curve. And one of the scholars quoted in the book, Charles Lynn, as the article points out, basically did extremely skewed studies. He compared Japanese and American children by looking at Japanese children from very upper-class families and American children that were carefully chosen to be representative of all classes. He based his findings on blacks in Africa, giving them a test which was specifically designed for people in the U.S. Army and included knowledge of such things as the game of tennis. So my first question is basically, how do you, if you've read this article, how do you reconcile these, these sort of statistical flaws in the research of Lynn, who is quoted, I think Derek said like 23 or 24 times in the book? And my second question comes from your response to what Derek asked you. You said something along the lines of, we can't discount their research based on their affiliation with this white supremacist publication. You didn't say white supremacist, but that's what it is. But my question is, how can you separate ideology and social science this way? How can you say, well, just because these people are associated with a racist publication doesn't mean that their recommendations aren't valid, that their social science isn't valid? It seems to me that social science is inherently tied into ideology. I mean, we don't normally take the KKK's proclamations about blacks to be true. And so, I mean, I guess my two questions are, first of all, to do with this actual statistical research behind the book, and secondly, how you can separate social science and ideology.
With respect to Lynn, yeah, I did read the article in the New York Review of Books, and yeah, I found it interesting. I went through the bell curve and found that, yeah, Lynn is cited several times. I guess, yeah, like 23, yes, along that. About that. But I think it's worth pointing out that within most of the footnotes Lynn has cited, he cited alongside other studies that are more trustworthy. And I think that, I don't know if we should fault Murray and Herrnstein for citing, for referring to various studies of questionable, some of questionable authenticity. I think it's a sign of intellectual honesty. For instance, in the Newsweek article that sort of panned the book, they refer to James Flynn. He's in Newsweek, in both the bell curve and Newsweek, they characterize him as a psychologist. He's actually a chairman of political science at the University of Otago in New Zealand. But Flynn has done studies that show that intelligence is actually rising in America, and so in one chapter of the bell curve, you see this mentioned. In another chapter of the book, you see them talk about dysgenic pressures, talking about how intelligence is going down. Now, it's clear in both cases you're looking at two different sorts of data. You're drawing different conclusions. I'm not so sure that that's such a bad thing. I think it's a sign of intellectual honesty. These guys have actually, showed different viewpoints on this quite complicated topic. I'm curious as to, I doubt seriously too many of Murray and Herrnstein's detractors exercise that same sort of honesty. As far as separating the ideology from social science, I think that it's easier in some venues. Statistics is one of those. I remember one of the demonstrators at the rally on Widener said she had read an article in Public Interest, I think, well, it wasn't Public Interest, but it was a magazine in 1931, that pointed to ways in which statistics can be manipulated. Well, she didn't bother to say how the statistics in the bell curve were manipulated. She just assumed that because they can be, they must have been in the bell curve. Well, the thing is with statistics, it's a venue in which one can judge another's study. So you can go through and see whether the study was wrong or not, or whether faulty logic was applied, irrespective of the researcher's ideology. So that would be my answer to that question.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions from over here and one from over here. So I know. Well, you can ask after. I'm sure that these guys will be more than happy. Go ahead.
My name is Brian Malone, and I'm a junior at the college, and my question is for Kristen, actually. You spoke briefly about some of the social problems that the black community is facing. I would like you to comment on what many see as the decline of the black family in America, such as a higher rate of black babies born out of wedlock or a higher number of black single mothers than among whites. What do you see as the causes of this decline? And also if Mr. McGuire would comment on that.
Well, I think most definitely the black family structure has evolved into one that's basically a matriarchal structure, where the mother is the head of the household. And because transmission of values is something that's very important, and it's documented that when the man is in the household, children will do better in school, and they will be able to kind of control this desire for immediate satisfaction. These are all psychological studies. And because in black families, the structure of the family has evolved to where women dominate, you have children now being raised who can't suppress this desire for immediate satisfaction, and thus you kind of have the reason for crime and other distractions which prevent children from doing well in school. And the second part of your question?
That was my question,
Okay.
but I'd like Brent to comment on that too, if you.
Yeah, I think as far as the cause of the decline in black family, if you look at the history, the black family in America was strong until about the emergence of the welfare state. In fact, there were more. A black man at the age of 24 was more likely to be married than a white man during that time, or at least actually that's not. I'm misquoting the statistic. But the fact is, the rates of illegitimacy, you find now that 67% of black children are born out of wedlock. There's almost twice the number of single-parent households in black communities than in white communities. I think it has a lot to do with the welfare state, which serves as sort of a bribe in terms of persuading the woman not to marry and to raise her children where she can alone, where she can receive a higher welfare check. I would also be careful not to use the word matriarchy to describe the black family. A matriarchy would be a system in which there was a man and a woman, but the woman ruled. The black matriarchy is not as such. There's only the woman present.
Brent, can you please clarify the distinctive effects of welfare on black families compared with all other families?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Well, you see it. I mean, it's also true for underclass whites, and they discuss this in the bell curve.
Thank you.
Hi. Oh, sorry, didn't realize it was that powerful. My name is David Latt, and I'm a junior in the college. I just have three. I have some fans out there, don't I? I just have three quick questions for Ms. Clark. The first one is, it seems that whenever we're trying to deal with these inequalities in IQ, we sort of like flee, to environmental causes to explain them. So 2 points on that. First of all, the study, in addition to the flawed study that Alice mentioned conducted by Lynn, there are other studies too that take a look at this problem in an international context and in places where blacks are not necessarily oppressed. And the differences still emerge. So one, how would you address that? Point number two, which Brent alluded to, even though they have not been oppressed to the extent that African Americans have been, Asian Americans and Jews as well have been oppressed within the United States. And so even though the oppression wasn't as big as African American oppression, you would expect that they would score, maybe slightly lower than whites, but actually in this test, they score above them. So how can you explain that if the environment plays such a big role? These groups were denied access to many opportunities, and they still come out on top in this sort of cognitive framework. And the third question I have is, in your opening remarks, you alluded to sort of the bell curve establishing this hierarchy where you said sort of like there are these I guess you mentioned the Jewish groups on top. Do you think that this is part of any larger conspiracy within the media? And those are my questions.
All right, let me try and work backwards through your questions. First of all, Murray and Herrnstein put Eastern European Jews at the top of this hierarchy. What they failed to do was examine non-Jews in the Eastern European region. So that was one of the main flaws in placing Eastern European Jews at the top of the hierarchy. Asians and Jews, yes, they are considered to be part of the oppressed minority in this group. But now I will get into the issue of melanin. We are definitely very visually stimulated in this country. Asians and Jews visually assimilate into white culture much more easily than I do. Asians are no longer called yellows, they're no longer called mongoloids or orientals, and certainly white culture has embraced them in much more easily than they have embraced in black people. And to the first part of your question, Murray and Herrnstein failed to address such issues as why blacks from the Caribbean or blacks from Africa do better than blacks in America, which suggests that there is something distinctive about American culture and American history which holds blacks back.
Okay, this is our final question.
Hi, I'm Josh. I'm a senior at the college, and I'd like to address my question to Brent. Basically, Derek brought up what to me is probably the most interesting aspect of this debate, which is the definition of G, which is constructed such that women and men, there's no difference. You've made the argument twice that the correlation, the relationship between IQ, intelligence, as a measure of intelligence, and income, there's a very high correlation. You said that, in fact, blacks do better than intelligence would predict because of affirmative action. That's the case you make. I was wondering how you might explain the fact that black women and white women have a third of the wage gap between them, as do black men and white men. I was wondering how you would explain the fact that white men have a 30-cent advantage over white women, given the fact that they have the same exact intelligence. So the wage gaps between black women and white women is much smaller than between black men and white men, and there's a tremendous wage gap between white men and white women, even though they have the same intelligence. And no credible study has shown that motherhood, whether it be a burden or a joy, or in any event, no credible study has shown that motherhood and the particular biological nature of women accounts for the entire difference.
Well, for statistical reasons that would be difficult to articulate, Galton would be the one to read about this. The fact is, men's and women's IQs are not the same. Men are much better at learning not to hiss.
Wrong
yeah.
again, Brent.
Yeah. A lot of effeminate men out there. No, but for the Spearman, as Derek pointed out, sort of, he equalized basically in the formulation of G the IQs between men and women. So you could then, there are all sorts of reasons why this was necessary to get a true statistical measure. But the fact is, they're not the same, and they're certainly not in different areas. Men are better at visual spatial skills, women better at verbal skills. Hence the S. So yeah, I think in fact that's if you G right now that there isn't an effective measure because G doesn't take into account differences of IQ between men and women. So it'd be interesting to have a measure and look into these disparities.
Let me just be clear. You're asserting not only that whites are smarter than blacks, that Jews are smarter than typical whites, and that Asians are smarter than Jews, but that men are smarter than women. Just so we can be clear.
I wouldn't use smarter.
Have higher IQs and are more intelligent.
Yeah, they do better on IQ tests.
And he's also arguing implicitly that G is completely meaningless because IQ is defined to be equal for men and women, yet he argues that IQ is different between men and women. G is nonsense.
Well, G is one very good approximation of intelligence.
Okay, Ms. Drake, excuse me. I know you said that was going to be the last question, but
Yeah.
I was inadvertently brought into this debate, and I feel I should be given the chance to clarify what was said about, or the question that was posed to me indirectly. Mr. McGuire stated, first let me explain who I am. My name is Allison Moore. I'm a sophomore in the college, and I am the vice president of the Black Student Association. Now, Mr. McGuire, you mentioned something to the effect of what I had said when we had our demonstration on Widener Step concerning an article that you said I didn't explain properly, so let me do that now. The article that I was talking about was an article written in 1931 by Edwin Sutherland, in which he broke down how statistics can be manipulated to say whatever it is you want them to say. And what he said in that article is that based on the ability of the mental tester, which I would say that, you know, Murray and Herrnstein being associated with Harvard, you know, the school pride that I have, I would think are quite capable mental testers. Depending on what those mental testers ask, what questions they ask, and who they decide to ask those questions to, they can get statistics to say whatever it is they want them to say, right? Now, in classic Crimson fashion, since you've asked me to clarify myself, I'd like you to clarify something that you said that no one seemed to address because you kind of blurted it out, and I don't know how many people caught it. On one of your many tirades against affirmative action, you mentioned something you said something to the effect of all affirmative action is doing is bringing giving blacks opportunities no matter how unqualified they are. So my question is to you, are you implying in that statement that blacks are not as qualified as white in any circumstance? You didn't seem to say that affirmative action would help blacks who have been discriminated against historically, get into positions that have historically they've been locked out of. So my question to you is, what did you mean by that comment? Are you saying that blacks are inferior to whites?
Okay, you can have a quick answer, and then we need to wind this up.
Oh, quick, okay. Well, once again, you failed to, on the basis of the article in 1931, shown how they've misselected their samples
Clear
in
that
the
up
bell
after
curve.
this, that's not a problem. Go ahead.
The second point, what was it really?
Affirmative action.
Oh, yeah, affirmative action. Oh, yeah, well my sentence was that in the professional workforce explicitly, where you find an even greater disparity between black IQs and white IQs than you find in the average population, suggesting that qualifications are lowered for blacks in at least among the professions. I mean, Murray and Herrnstein break up the labor market into about 8, 9 different categories, the highest of which is the professions. And in answer to the very last question, no.
Okay, on that note, we'll end. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming out tonight, and thanks. It was fun.